So welcome to the future state mapping portion of Lean Manufacturing Champion. As you recall, you have created a current state map, and here's a current state map on the screen. Some of the things to remember from your current state map is that we were primarily pushing product through the process, and there was inventory, work in process, represented by the I symbols between each of the value-added steps, causing us to have fairly long lead times when we calculated how many days of customer demand we had between each step. The information flow was very directive from, in this case, production supervisor, very often from planning. So you recall that from creating your current state map. Well, now we're going to work on creating a future state map. So we're going to switch views here and show you an example of a future state map. Now this you'll recognize as the Acme future state map. And here's some important differences I'd like you to notice. Right now on this map, the future state map, we are no longer pushing product through the process. So our work in process is represented by these backwards E symbols, which are supermarkets. And what this means is that we are producing product only to demand. The demand is signaled by, in this case, a card, a Kanban, which flows, for example, from the supermarket of stampings back to stamping, instructing stamping to create a new batch of product. From stamping, we pull out into weld and assembly, and that's pulled at a certain rate or a certain pitch, in which welding and assembly produces product, and then it's replenished from the stores of stamped goods. Same thing occurs here at finished goods. So welding assembly produces into the finished goods supermarket, but only based on a signal that's demand from the customer. So as we pull out of this supermarket of finished goods to ship, then a signal goes back to assembly to produce, a signal goes back to stamping to produce, and then we even have a signal back to the vendor. As you can see, there's a supermarket of raw material. We even signal back to the vendor to provide raw material, replenish what we've used. So this process works the opposite direction. There's a pull from the customer that pulls product through. In the current state map you created, we push product through, causing these excess inventories and all the waste that's attended with that, all of the 8 waste. You also notice that the lead time ladder is significantly different in this future state. Because we don't have all this WIP in the process, we're able to dramatically reduce lead times. Cycle times haven't changed that much. Now, we did have to address cycle times somewhat because you'll notice weld and assembly is now combined. In the current state map for Acme, those were all separate functions. In the future state map, we've combined them into one work cell. Well, in order to do that, there was some work content that was a few seconds too much. So these symbols here are Kaizen bursts. That represents specific projects we took on, in this case to reduce work content to less than or equal to 165 seconds. There's also a Kaizen burst over here because, as you recall from the current state map, the second spot welder 2, had a problem with its reliability. Its uptime was not what is needed to operate within a cell. Different than a push system where we have an unreliable operation, we can just build WIP in to account for when that's down. That can't happen in a cell, so we had to increase the uptime of the spot welder 2. The third one is the spot welder setup time, or changeover time. In a cell, those changeover times have to go very quickly because we're changing over the entire cell. So the spot welder setup time or changeover time had to be addressed and reduced. So these are the specific Kaizen bursts or projects we had to do in order to move from the current state to the future state. You'll also notice that the communication now is much different. Remember, this is the communication portion. And instead of directing each of the operation through a printed schedule from the supervisor, now we are just using signals to produce. We do have to tell the shipping department when to ship what, because that's determined by the customer. Customer tells us what they want when, production control issues that shipping schedule to shipping, and that product is shipped out. When that happens, it begins the pull cycle that pulls product all the way through the process. The communication process at the top from customer to us is very similar to what it was in the current state, and from us to our vendor is very similar. The big difference there is that instead of going through MRP in this case, we actually have a Kanban for the vendor to supply us raw material. So that in a nutshell is the biggest difference between the Acme current state that you created and this future state. And you will be creating a future state, a live future state, at the workplace, so you'll be able to see exactly how this works in action.